Bom, pessoal, eu deixo aqui dar seguimento então aos nossos seminários desse semestre aí. Tenho a satisfação, o prazer, a honra de trazer aqui o professor Whitten. O professor Whitten, ele vem frequentemente ao Brasil, aqueles que não sabem. Ele vem dar cursos lá como participante constante dos cursos de metodologia que ocorrem de verão da IPSA, né, que é a International Political Science Association. Ele tem cursos de verão regulares na USP, organizados, inclusive os últimos tinham sido organizados pela professora Lorena aqui. Então, aqueles que quiserem também participar dos cursos, o professor Gai é um ótimo professor, vem dar curso aqui. Mas eu pedi para ele, conversando com ele, para ele vir trazer, apresentar, porque ele também é uma figura muito conhecida nessa área de economic forum. Ele tem trabalhos muito conhecidos, e aí eu pedi a ele para fazer uma more substantive presentation than the methodological one. Ele então veio apresentar para nós o último trabalho dele sobre economic forum. Mas o professor Gai é uma figura muito importante, tanto no campo da metodologia como no campo do economic forum. Ele pesquisa eleitorais em geral, porque ele tem se especializado. Nesse sentido, eu acho que é uma pessoa muito próxima aos nossos interesses, né? Very close organs. Então, eu acho que vocês têm aqui bastante para aproveitar com ele. E para aqueles que tiverem possibilidade, gostaria que agendassem aí para o próximo ano os cursos de verão da USP, que são, de fato, muito bons, tanto no qualitativo quanto no quantitativo. Bom, eu não vou falar mais, vou agora passar a palavra para o nosso convidado, our guest, Professor Whitten. Thank you very much for coming down here, and we're very honored to have you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm always happy to talk about economic voting, which I always think about when I get invited to give a presentation on economic voting. I always think about an experience that I had in graduate school, and I moved with one of my advisors to a different university, and I got an office next to a guy named Doug Arnold, who is a pretty famous scholar of congressional politics. And he said, "What are you doing your dissertation on?" And I was very honored to talk to this famous scholar. And I said, "Oh, I'm doing this project on economic voting and looking at it across countries." And Doug said, "Oh, I have something you should read." And he went and pulled an old off-print from an article, and it was an article about overtilled and undertilled fields, so using an agricultural analogy of political science. And of course, one of the overtilled fields was economic voting. And so this was his subtle way of telling me that I should do something else. And I always think about Doug on that. And on the one hand, I think he actually had a very good point, which is that we've got lots of studies of economic voting. I mean, there's over 1,000 published articles just testing the basic proposition that the economy affects election outcomes. And so maybe it is somewhat overstudied. On the other hand, I keep seeing new things happening in the world. You know, the recent economic crisis, which has such a global component to it, and I think we get all these new opportunities, new interesting data become available, on a weekly basis, certainly, maybe even on a daily or hourly basis, that allow us to study this basic representational linkage that's so important in political economy and democratic politics in general. So hopefully by the end of the discussion today, you won't think that we're so overtilled that we should stop. What I thought I'd do is just sort of put this current project that I'm going to present into kind of a broader perspective of where we've been, where we're coming from, and some of the work that I'm currently doing. So some of the things that I see us doing in the future in this area of political economy research. So if we think about the early models of economic voting, they were usually done as very basic time series models in a single country. A lot of them were done in the United States and the United Kingdom. So I'm talking about works by people like Goodhart and Gonzalez, Ray Fair, Gerald Kramer, and they're testing just a very straightforward theory about the objective economy impacting people's vote choice, and usually, like I said, doing it at the aggregate level. And in these are studies, in some of them in the late 60s and the early 70s, but in the late 70s, Gerald Kramer wrote a paper that kind of blew the study of economic voting wide open and introduced what we call the Kramer problem that we're still grappling with. And I see this as a fundamental problem that is still every economic voting paper has to deal with it, and that is to say, what is the politically relevant part of people's economic evaluations? And so this is this business of saying, do people think about their own pocketbook, or do they think about how the country as a whole is doing? And certainly the possibility is that people do some part of each of those, and then what part of the economic reality or your economic experience that you think is going on, what part of it do you hold the government accountable for? And that's just a fundamental question. We're still grappling with it. If we think about globalization, that introduces a whole other dimension of deciding what your government's responsible for and what they might not be responsible for. What's a good performance? What's a bad performance? All of these questions come out of the quote-unquote Kramer problem that he wrote about in '78. Not too long after that, Douglas Hibbs came up with the idea that, the ideology of governing parties might play a role in terms of our evaluations of what's politically relevant. And in particular, what Hibbs proposed was that right-wing parties would naturally be better at dealing with inflation. Left-wing parties would be more concerned and better at dealing with unemployment. And so we might expect to see them held accountable in different ways, depending on what they're good for, what they're supposed to be good at, what they're supposed to care about. And this raises some of the questions, fundamental questions about, are we making retrospective evaluations? So are we thinking about how the economy's been in the past? Or are we making prospective evaluations? Are we thinking, here are the problems that we have, the economic problems that we have, who's the best at handling the problems that we have? And often we would think that the retrospective versus prospective would lead to very different decisions from the same voters, right? And in the early 90s, Bing Powell and I were really spurred into our own paper on this, on comparative economic voting by some early work by people like Michael Lewis Beck and Martin Powden. And they were trying to look at, if you look across countries, some countries have really strong economic voting relationships, others don't. And then also, if you look within countries over time, there's some elections where we see really strong effects of the economy and others where we don't. And so there's this puzzle, why is the economy stronger in some circumstances than in others? And Bing and I propose a theory of what we call clarity of responsibility. And the idea is that there's an interactive relationship. And at its core, it's a very basic idea, saying that if you can, as a citizen of the country, look at the government and say that's the party. It's those are the guys that messed everything up, or those are the guys that have been leading the country and doing a really good job. Then you have clear responsibility, and you would hold them accountable. You would punish them if they've done badly on the economy, or reward them if they've done well. And that it would be very straightforward. We would expect to see economic voting. On the other hand, there's circumstances like coalition government or multiple branches of government being held by different types of parties from the left and the right. And then we would say, well, then we don't have a clear sense of who's responsible. We don't have clarity of responsibility. And so the voters are confused. They don't know who to reward, and they don't know who to punish. And so in those circumstances, we wouldn't expect to see the economy have an effect. And this basic idea of clarity of responsibility, when Bing and I measured it, we measured it mostly with institutional variables in mind. And you know, did the institutions allow the party that controlled that institution to have any real power or not? And what was the pattern of control? Is it all in one party's hands, or is it spread out across the political parties? So that was our basic idea. But there have been a lot of other formulations of the idea of clarity of responsibility, a lot of other ways that people have measured it in the years since we wrote this. But it's always the same basic proposition that when responsibility for policymaking is clear, then you're going to see strong economic voting. When responsibility for policymaking is less clear, we would see less economic voting. So, if this works.
Where would like to slide?
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. So this sort of brings us to the next part of the puzzle that I'm interested in right now, and I've got several different papers that are trying to do the same thing. If you actually, if you go back one, okay. No, that's good. Yeah. No, thank you. So if we think about this, the one of the things that's missing is the elite strategy, right? So the elites, when they're in power, they do their best to manage the economy, right? We would think that because they want to get reelected. But other than that, elites are kind of out of this picture. And so what I'm interested in is thinking about elite strategy and thinking about it in several different ways. One of the things that we can think about with elite strategy is if the economy is done poorly, then we would think, well, the government should try to talk about something else, right? Talk about foreign policy, talk about transportation policy, or some other area where they feel like they've had success. And of course, the opposition would try to say, no, let's talk about the economy. And you guys messed the economy up, right? And so that's one of the ideas that we have in there. Another idea that we have with bringing elite strategy in is party ideology. And there's this huge literature out there in political science and economics that talks about the location of the parties relative to each other. And the most famous early work on this is Anthony Downs, right? With the idea of thinking about the distribution of voters and where the political parties should best position themselves in order to win elections. The thing that's always been missing from Downs's world and all the papers that have followed Downs is that there's no element, or very little element, of who's the incumbent and their performance while in government. Economic voting, on the other hand, has completely ignored them, even though two big areas of the same disciplines that are trying to study, what determines elections. So we're studying the same things. And up until now, we've basically been talking about a lot of the same things, but pretending like the other side doesn't exist. And so one of our big ambitions with this current project is to try to bring these two areas together a little bit. So that's what this paper that I'm talking about today is all about. And we're trying to get a lot of leverage on the role of elites in economic voting by bringing together these two areas. So we'll see. That's kind of the big goal. And so our motivating questions all fall from this attempt to combine these two things. One question is, how does the relative spatial placement of political parties affect economic voting? For the most part, we've entirely ignored this up until now. how does clarity of responsibility shape these processes? Obviously, I care a lot about clarity of responsibility, so always going to be looking at that. And in particular, what I'm interested in is what determines party support in low clarity settings. If you think about our theory of clarity of responsibility, what it is it's a theory about what's not going to happen in the low clarity settings. So if it's hard to tell who's in charge, then what we're saying is then voters won't use the economy to make their decisions. Well, it's a reasonable theory, I think, but it's a little bit unsatisfying because it's a theory about what's not going to happen. And I think we want to know what's going to happen. And part of the motivation for going after this particular question with these spatial models is that if we look at the countries that have low clarity of responsibility most of the time, they're countries that have very complicated ideological menus, and they're also countries where the voters can place those parties ideologically relative to each other. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more. And what the really amazing thing about those countries with the really rich political menu to choose from is that those voters tend to be able to place the parties better than the voters in the countries with only 2 or 3 choices. So if you look at survey evidence from the United Kingdom, where there's basically Labour, the Conservatives, and the Liberal Democrats, very low percentages of voters can place those 3 parties ideologically relative to each other. But then you go to Denmark, where there's 7 parties, and they're very rich political menu, lots of different ideological positions. Something like 90% of the voters can put those parties in the exact same order, the agreed upon order ideologically. So that's that, and that would be a low clarity setting. So it's sort of an interesting puzzle for us to disentangle. Okay, so to just kind of talk through the basic terrain of what we have in mind, the focus of this initial study, and this initial study that I'm presenting to you today is with Larry Williams, who's one of my former PhD students who's now at the University of Missouri. We've been working on these projects together. We're mostly studying these stable, rich, democratic nations, stable economically generally, and politically, and the reason for that is because that's where the data are. And as you'll see, we need pretty sophisticated data. I think that these types of theories can be translated into other settings. The current study is very much focused on parliamentary democracies, so we're not studying the United States, even though we're from the U.S., because we're thinking about the parties as the real unit here. But I think that it can very much be translated into presidential systems. Excuse me. Oh, that's going to sound good. Try not to do that to you again. I think we can translate a lot of this theoretical thinking to the presidential systems like we have here in the Americas. So anyway, so here's two actual elections, and what we have is 2 elections that take place when the economy is doing really badly, right? One in Ireland in 1981, one in the Netherlands 1982. Growth has fallen. Aggregate economic output has shrank in real terms by just over a percentage point in both of these scenarios, and we can see the location ideologically, and this is from the Manifestos project, which takes the parties' platforms, so they're basically the document that they publish at the time of the election, and encodes all the sentences in that document to then place the parties on a left-right scale, right? So this is the menu that voters in the Netherlands and Ireland had to choose from in these elections in the early 80s, the parties in these sort of lollipops convey a few things. The dark diamond indicates the party of the prime minister. The gray diamond indicates that this is a government party, but not the prime minister. So they were in the governing coalition, meaning that they had at least one cabinet ministry that they controlled. And then opposition are the little circles, the open circles, the ones that really look like lollipops. And then the height of these figures indicates the percentage of seats that party controlled in the national legislature, so in the first chamber, right? And so what we can see in the Irish situation is Fianna Fáil has over 50% of the seats. They have a single party majority, right? Whereas in the Netherlands, the Christian Democrats are just over 30% of the seats, the largest party, the party of the prime minister, but they have two coalition partners here that they were in government together with, and then opposition parties as well, opposition parties on either side of Fianna Fáil. And if we think about the economic voting literature, basically what it would say is here we have very clear responsibility. Fianna Fáil is a single party government. They don't have the opposition controlling anything else that is of any political matter, right? And so basically we would expect them to take a beating at the polls, right? We think they're gonna lose a lot of votes. We don't have any theory about where the votes are going to go to, whether they're going to go to Labour or Fine Gael, but we're just predicting, yeah, it's clear that Fianna Fáil is responsible, and the economy, by any objective standard, is in really bad shape. So they're going to do poorly. Now, what the economic voting literature would say here in this Dutch scenario is, well, you don't really have clear responsibility. You have a three-party coalition. Also in the Netherlands, they have a committee system in the legislature in which opposition parties have real control. So they control the agenda for particular issue areas. And so that muddies the water in terms of who's responsible for policy making. And so we would expect that in this situation, there's not going to be a lot of economic voting. All right, well that's not very satisfying. This is a theory about what's not going to happen. Now, if we think about the spatial literature, so the work coming out of Downs, their theory is what matters is the distribution of the voters, right? And their theory is always that whichever party is closest to you on this ideological scale is the party that you're going to vote for, period. Right? And I think on its own, that's also pretty unsatisfying. So what we're trying to do in this project is to bring together those two areas of research to try to develop a theory that borrows from both of them. So our theory, we call our theory a theory of spatial contagion effects. And the assumptions that we have here are that voters know the relative ideological placement of the political parties in the country. And as I said, there's survey evidence. A lot of this evidence has been collected by Randy Stevenson at Rice University, looking at where do European voters know the parties' placements relative to each other. And they show that there's a high degree of knowledge of the placement, especially when the menu is particularly complicated. We also make the assumption that voters know the party of the prime minister, which is not too controversial. The survey evidence is across all of the European countries where this has been asked on surveys, shows that 90% of people can tell you the party of the prime minister, 90% or more in all of these countries. So ideology is important. They know how to use it. So our theoretical propositions that come from these two basic assumptions, and then are thinking about what's going on, The first is this spatial contagion effect, that when a party is evaluated by voters as doing poorly, it'll have an impact on that party's support, of course, but it'll also have an effect on the parties that are located close to it ideologically. And so the basic idea here is that voters link parties based on their ideology, and they say, well, you know, if that party's doing badly, then a party that's really close to it in terms of ideology is also going to do badly for us. And so you can think about it as like a commercial brand. And when a party close to you ideologically has done badly, they've soiled the brand. They've ruined it for everybody in an ideological neighborhood. And we think that these effects are going to be contingent on the level of clarity of responsibility. And so when clarity of responsibility is high, we expect stronger economic voting and smaller spatial contagion effects, because you can tell who's in charge. And so you're going to be less likely to link the parties that are close to them ideologically. When clarity of responsibility is low, we expect that strong spatial effects and economic voting, mostly for the party of the prime minister, because everybody knows who the party of the prime minister is. Even though they didn't have a majority of the seats in the legislature, they're still the party that's closest to being in charge of all the parties that are there. And then, you know, across that's just a general theory. We think that the prime minister is going to pay more in terms of economic voting across all these things. Okay. So if we think back to these two scenarios that we were talking about, then our theory of spatial contagion effects says that we think that, of course, Fianna Gael is going to do quite poorly. We think that, Fianna Fáil, I have trouble remembering my Irish parties, that they're going to do quite poorly. And if you think, well, Labour is a little bit closer to Fianna Fáil, so that might hurt them because of the spatial dimension. And Fianna Gael should do quite well. If we think in terms of this scenario, we're saying, okay, now we have a theory about something that's going to happen, and that is we think the Christian Democrats are going to do poorly because that's the party of the prime minister. We think that D66 and the Radicals, because they're so close to the Christian Democrats, are also going to lose votes. Note, one of them is an opposition party, the other one's a government party, but we're saying because they're in an ideological neighborhood, that brand has been soiled, and that people want to go away from that brand. And Labour, it depends how far the reach is of the brand, but the party that we think is going to do really well is the Liberals, right? Because they're a long way from the Christian Democrats. So it's a different theory from before, and as I said, it combines the theoretical elements from economic voting with elements from this whole spatial literature. And so if we think about the hypotheses that come from this theory, these are just trying to get closer in terms of the statistical expectations that we have. We have the spatial contagion hypothesis that we express as the larger the distance between a pair of parties, the more negatively correlated their vote shares will be. Spatial contagion clarity just says that we think it's going to be strongest in the low clarity settings. The classic clarity responsibility hypothesis that economic voting will be strongest when responsibility for policy making is most clear. And then finally, this idea about the Prime Minister having the strongest economic voting effects. So one reason why these two literatures haven't been combined before is that we don't have a good statistical method for combining them, or until recently we didn't have a good statistical method for combining these two and testing theories like this spatial contagion hypothesis about the distance between a pair of parties. And now as political science often does, we've adopted, for us, a new methodology. It's actually been around in one form or the other since the 1950s, but they've been very, very complicated models to estimate and not available in any regular software packages. So it's a bit of an excuse, right? And that is the spatial autoregressive models. Now these models are used a lot in studies of international relations. They're also used a lot in economic studies, and a variety of different disciplines are starting to use these, and their popularity is really taking off. But if we think about international relations, the way they use it, the dominant variable, anybody know what that would be? The spatial variable? It's geography. And so it's saying, when there's a civil war in one country, that there's more likely to be civil wars in neighboring countries, that countries are more likely, here, how about this one, this just in, countries that are closer to each other geographically are more likely to fight wars with each other. Right? Ooh, okay. Yeah, so they're using geography, and what we're saying is, this is kind of like ideological geography, right? Now, there have been other variables that have been used as spatial variables. People in international relations have used trade relationships, so they specify the weights matrix based on that. As I said, what you're doing, what's different here from a regression model is this W and this rho, which are multiplied by Y, and I love talking about this stuff. But I'll save most of the technical stuff for your question and answer. If you guys want to get into it, we certainly can get into it. Here's the reduced form of the equation. And an important point here is that if this rho term is equal to 0, meaning that there's no spatial relationships, then your model just collapses to a basic OLS model, just a basic regression model. And so the art in these models is in the specification of this W. And so if you're in international relations and you're specifying this W, you might use geography, and sometimes you measure it as the distance between the two capital cities. Sometimes you measure it as a dummy variable equal to 1 if the countries share a border, 0 otherwise, right? The way that we're doing it is it's looking at each pair of parties in a given election, in a given year, in a given country, and saying, what is their relationship in terms of how far apart are they on that ideological scale? And we did it a couple different ways. I'll be happy to talk at length about that in the Q&A, but I'll just kind of get going. So that's let's see. I'll have one more pretty technical slide just to give us some of the ideas here, and then we'll look at some results pretty quickly here. So basically, the main moving parts are your independent variables, your x's, right, which are going to be the usual suspects in terms of economic voting. So the measure of the economy, are you the party of the prime minister, all of that stuff. The W, which measures the spatial connections between the cases, and then that rho, which will measure whether or not we have any spatial relationships. In our setting, the Y is the vote percentage change for a party from the previous election. So did you gain or lose votes? The X variables are measures of the economy. Timing of the elections. Do you have flexible election timing here? No, okay. But this is in some of the countries that we're studying, some parliamentary countries, the government can call early elections, right? So I mean, one of the most famous cases of this is Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s called an early election right after the Falkland Islands War, right? Because they'd won the war, and even though the economy wasn't doing that well, her popularity was really high. So we want to take into account the timing of elections. It's a major advantage for incumbents in some of the countries that we're looking at. party characteristics, and I'll talk about that a little bit, coalition characteristics as well. And when we're using spatial models, we talk about the betas, which would normally be our main focus of interest in regular regression. We talk about them as being pre-spatial estimates. And this is kind of this counterfactual. We're saying, these are saying, if there were no spatial effects, what would the effect of each independent variable, each x, be on y? And then we get the spatial effects, which come from the row hat, which is estimated based on the value of w. Okay.
The
Yeah.
unit of analysis, just to make it clear, the unit of analysis, each line you have
One party.
one part.
And so, yeah, no, it's a good question, thank you. So the unit of analysis is each party, and you can think about each party as occurring in a particular country in a particular election. So it's a I guess party IJT, right? And the parties have different characteristics, and you can see some of our variables here. We'll look at this really ugly table, and we'll quickly move to some graphs that'll elucidate this more. But this gives you an idea of what the variables are, and I think that'll help answer your question. So the real growth in GDP per capita is obviously our main economic variable, which is the most popular economic voting variable, and that would apply to every case from a particular country, every party in a particular country in a particular election year. And of course, we have that interacted with whether or not you're a government party, and then whether or not you're the prime minister's party. So that's what we're looking at here. And then we have, this is the time left in the constitutionally mandated inter-election period. If there's more time left, that means you call it an early election. And then we have some variables so those are all by country year, and then variables like government party is by party. Right? So yeah, it's a complicated multi-level data structure. And as I said before, everything below the line between these two lines is what we would call a pre-spatial effect, and it all gets modified based on the W matrix by these row values, and rho is the parameter of spatial autocorrelation. So in order to really understand what's going on, we have to take both the rho and the W matrix into account as we interpret these parameters. So what we're looking at below that line, between the big space here, is values that look a lot like a regular OLS model, but now we've added this level of complexity to them. And we can interpret these the same way that we normally would interpret results. So if we look at government party times growth, it's positive and statistically significant, as we would expect. If you're in government and the economy is growing, then you get rewarded. We look at, this is the effect of the opposition. It's negative and statistically significant. If the votes go up for the government, the vote's going to go down for the opposition, right? So not too surprising. What is a little surprising is that the Prime Minister's party is not statistically distinguishable from other government parties in the high clarity setting. In the low clarity setting, we actually find economic voting, but it's only for the party of the Prime Minister. If we look at the timing effects, they're actually quite large, and the way we can puzzle these out is we see that if you're an opposition party and the government calls an early election, it hurts you. If you're a government party and you call an early election, you benefit, and how much you benefit or hurt depends on how early the election is called. We really put those effects in there as a control, but we found that they came out quite strong. So it's a big advantage to be able to call the election whenever you want to. I think most people would say, "Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense." Formal theorists hate this, right? So the people that use formal models, because they show informal models that voters will be smarter, and they'll know that if you're calling an early election, that's actually a sign of incompetence. Well, you know, I like formal models, but I like real world data even better. So the formal modelers have this wrong. Okay, so we've spent way too much time on this ugly table of regression coefficients. Here's one more table. This is because we had a lot of interactions in there. These help to show us confidence intervals around the different interactions. And it's basically the story that we saw earlier. We find strong economic voting in the high clarity setting, but we don't find it for the party of the Prime Minister, which is not what we were expecting. And in the low clarity setting, we find it for the party of Prime Minister, and so that's a new result. And so there is some economic voting in these low clarity settings. Huge effects, much bigger than we expected for the timing. And so that's something, as I said, we just put that in there as a control, but I think we're gonna pursue that even further because it, as I said, it does run contrary to what the formal modelers tell us we should be finding. So that's always fun. And then those effects are quite large. So to try to see, and so of course all these effects are pre-spatial, and to try to see how the spatial effects work together, we've done some simulations. And the first simulation is a very basic one where we have two parties, party A and party B, and what we're doing is we're starting off with party B anchored at 100, so right in the middle of the left-right ideological scale, and then we're saying, okay, let's move party A around, and let's see how the votes for party B and party A change. Oh, and party B was predicted to lose 5% of the vote, and party A was predicted not to have any change in the vote in the pre-spatial part of the model. So now we look at the spatial effects by moving left and right, and as you notice, nothing changes when we move party A to the left or the right. And let me be clear, as we move party A, we also could see changes for party B, but we're not seeing anything, we're not seeing any action. And that's because this comes from the high clarity model, and if we look back at the table, we had a very small estimated row effect, negative 0.002, but if we look at the low clarity, the spatial effect is about 5 times as strong, 0.010, and we can say, well, how does that play out? Glad you asked. This is how it plays out. So now we keep party B anchored at 100 on so right in the middle of the left-right scale, and now we say, well, let's start out with party A right at 100 also, and let's see what happens to the vote share for both parties, because they're spatially linked, as we move party A around. And so if we move party A to the left, what we see is that their vote share increases, right? And as their vote share goes up, the vote share for party B goes down. So this is where we get the title of the paper, right? Don't stand so close to me, right? Because if this party is going to be doing poorly, the best thing that party A can do is move away from them, right? So we're seeing that effect that we predicted of there being a spatial contagion, right? Let me show you another, but we're only seeing that effect in the low clarity setting. So we're seeing it in the low clarity, but not in the high clarity. Now let's take a look at another figure. Yeah. So this is looking at the Prime Minister's party's left-right position. We have an opposition party that's predicted to lose 0.08 of the vote, and now we're saying that we're going to move them around. Here's the marginal effect of growth as we move them around. We see the marginal effect is changing And this is again in a low clarity setting. I think the easiest or the best way to see these things is to take a case from the real world. And again, we'll take another Dutch case. This is from the Dutch elections in 1994, when there were 4 major parties competing. And the 4 major parties are the D66, the Christian Democratic Appeal, the Labour Party, Party van de Arbeid, which their position, these are their actual ideological positions, right? And then the VVD, which is the Dutch Liberal Party, right? And so that was their actual positions. And what we're saying is, we're going to hold these other 3 parties constant at their positions, and we're going to move the Labour Party to the left and the right and see how their vote share, their predicted vote changes, right? And we can see that D66 was predicted to gain votes from the pre-spatial effects. The Christian Democrats, which were the party of the Prime Minister, were very unpopular. They're predicted to lose 2.2% of the vote, and then the Liberals were supposed to gain. And so what happens to PVDA, the Labour Party, as they move around? If they move closer to the Christian Democrats, they lose votes. Okay? If they move away from them to the right, towards the Liberals, they gain votes. And in fact, the best position for them would have been ideologically to locate themselves right next to the Liberal Party, which was the party that was most expected to benefit in this election. And then if they move to the right of the Liberal Party, the further they move away, the greater their vote losses. Okay? We can also see that that if they leapfrog, meaning that they go to the left of the Christian Democrats, they actually begin to gain votes because they're moving closer to D66. And then as they move to the left of D66, they lose votes again. So we're taking a real world case and seeing how this model works. Incidentally, we tried a lot of different spatial weighting. This simulation comes from a spatial weighting where we're putting only the neighbor parties matter. So it's only the parties to the right and the left of you that matter. If you're out on the extreme right, it's only the one party to your left. If you're on the extreme left, it's only the one party on your right that matters. And I can show you how you would change the W matrix to account for that. So the W matrix is where you account for that. So now here's another figure, but this time we're saying what happens if D66 moves around. Remember, they're the party out on the left of these 4 parties, and they were supposed to gain some votes, as you can see from their predicted value here. And what we see is that D66, all they had to do was move to the left. The more to the left they move, the more they gain votes. Well, why is that? Because they're moving away from the unpopular Christian Democrats. Voters want to change from this party, and so the more you move away from them, the better you do. If they move out this way, their fortunes vary as they move between the parties. A little bit better as they move towards the Liberals. If they were to go way out to the right, they're going to lose votes.
Sorry, I didn't understand. Why is it not bell-shaped like the other?
Yeah.
In the left side, because you're saying that if you become a radical left, you gain more votes.
Yeah.
And this is not.
If your intuition is that there must be a limit to that, you're absolutely right. I totally agree. And this is our first cut at this, and so that's unrealistic, right? And one of the things that the spatial modelers, I mean, they actually really like this because we're paying attention to them, right? But they quibble and they say, well, come on, there's a limit to how much you can move voters. If Lula started, I guess he can't run for election again. I don't know. I'm not going to get into Brazilian politics. I think that's under control. But if he suddenly started talking a very right-wing agenda, no social spending, people aren't going to believe it. They're going to think there's something wrong with it, right? So your movement as a party in this space is limited, absolutely, without a doubt. And in this first cut of the paper, we left that alone. But you're absolutely right, and I agree. And so I'll just continue to show these. Here's the Christian Democrats. If they move around, the bad news for them is they're going to lose votes, right? Because they did a bad job, managing things. And so, but they could have bettered themselves a little bit by moving close to the D66, but their whole space is in the negatives. And then here's the VVD, and again, the further to the right, the further they get away from labor, the better they're going to do. Okay, and you're absolutely right that it's unrealistic to think of them going all the way down. And so if we take these things, of course, what's going on? Well, in the run-up to the election, every party is making their decision of where should we be ideologically? What should we try to sell? How should we try to market our brand to the voters? Should we try to move ourselves a little to the left or a little bit to the right? And so these strategic decisions are all happening at the same time. What I think is really exciting about this class of models is that it allows us to account for all of that strategic maneuvering at the same time. If you think about a standard OLS model, so a basic regression model, what are the assumptions about the error term? I know you guys have all had the econometrics class, or most of you have. You get those assumptions, buried into your head. Well, one of them, the assumptions about the error term, of course, is that they're independent and identically distributed, right? These models relax that independently distributed thing. And if you think about party competition, are they making their decisions independent of what the other parties are doing? Of course not. Of course not. They're trying to anticipate your opponent's next move. It's a strategic situation, right? Played by people who are professionals, right? There's all these why do we give campaign consultants so much money? Because they're supposed to be able to think a couple moves ahead and maneuver you, craft your image in the best possible way. And so these models, they're certainly not without problems, and I'll be happy to talk about that. But they allow us for the first time to take that type of strategic context into account and to relax this basically ridiculous assumption that these observations are independent of each other, right? And so just to, before we go to questions, if we go back to the scenarios, this is what actually happened in these cases, in the two cases that we were talking about at the beginning. As expected, Fianna Fáil took a real beating in the elections. They lost over 5% of the vote. But look, Labour also lost votes. And we said, why would Labour lose votes? Well, they're closer to Fianna Fáil than the Fine Gael party, which gained a tremendous amount of votes and actually became the party of the Prime Minister. And if we look at the Dutch case, what happened? Well, Christian Democrats lost votes in 1982. D66, who was in government with them, also lost votes. The radicals, who were in opposition, they're close to the Christian Democrats, so they lost votes. Labour, who was actually in government when the economy is in horrible shape, actually benefits. Why do they benefit? Well, they benefit because they're removed from the Christian Democrats and D66, and then the Liberals, as we expected, benefited a lot. And these results, this result would have basically been fine with the current economic voting theories, although we wouldn't be able to explain what happened to Labour. But this particular set of results would be a mystery to both the economic voting literature and the spatial literature. But with our theory, we can actually explain what happened. Of course, I picked these cases because they work, right? They weren't picked at random, but So our preliminary conclusions from this first paper in this bigger project are that in high clarity settings, relative spatial locations don't seem to matter that much, but economic voting is strong. But in the low clarity settings, we actually have something to say now about economic voting, and that is that we think there's going to be strong spatial contagion effects. Economic voting will mostly be for the party of the prime minister, and this business about endogenous election timing, the idea of, it's like you're at a track race, and one of the competitors holds the starter's pistol. So I'm getting ready to race George. I'll wait until he ties his shoe, and then I'm going to shoot the pistol and start running. Right? So that really matters, and that matters in both settings. And that, as I said, that was the real surprise of this project, that we found those results to be so strong. Happy to talk about any of the substantive or methodological business. Look forward to it. And I'd love to hear your ideas about your reactions to it, and in particular, with this work in Brazil.
Thank you very much. We are open now for questions. You can make your questions in English or Portuguese. If you make it in Portuguese, I will translate. How to translate tonight. So we are open for questions. Any questions?
I just want to understand better the whole parameter.
Yeah,
Is that kind of an autocorrelation index?
It is. It's spatial autocorrelation, though, which is what we're not used to seeing when we think about autocorrelation. So if you think about the basic assumption in your typical regression textbook would be that the error between u sub I and u sub j are maybe over here. I got an eraser and everything. Oh, we run out of space. All right, here. Expected value of u sub I, u sub j equals 0 for all I not equal to j. So it's always written in a very generic specification, but in practice, what do we care about? What do we worry about? We worry about it in the time series context. Right, and we worry about mostly, first order autocorrelation. And most of the canned statistical tests are for first order autocorrelation. And so what we're doing in these models is we're relaxing this assumption, and in fact we're turning it. If you think about how we treat this most of the time, we treat it as a statistical disease, and we try to find a cure with various FGLS procedures, right? What we're saying is, well, we're worrying about not this particular type of autocorrelation. We're worrying about it between cases that happen at the same time in the same country, and instead of treating it like a statistical disease, we're treating it as something of theoretical interest. We want to know, why those errors are linked together. And so to show you, I've got some slides in here that'll show how we construct that. So here's 2 elections in Canada, right? And they've got the same 4 parties, and here are their left-right positions across those 2 elections. So the way that we would construct the weights matrix is we say, okay, well, what's the distance between the parties? So we measure that. Exactly. That now, we're not worried about the parties from the relationship between 72 and 74. Okay, we're just saying within that one election, and you could certainly worry about how much did they move, and we have some measures of that, but they didn't really do very much. And so that's so that would be the weights matrix. Now, in the one that I showed you guys, we only allowed the two parties on either side to be relevant, so we would set the other values to be 0. And that, and to show you, yeah, so we estimated 4 different types. One, we use different metrics, and so we're saying absolute distance versus distance squared, and this comes out of the formal literature on spatial models. Yeah, it's talking about diminishing returns on distance. And then we tried the criteria. Are we measuring you relative to every party in the election that you're competing in, or your neighbors only? And so we tried all
southern neighbors or northern neighbors.
Exactly. So we tried all the possible combinations of those, and we tried them for both the clear and the unclear. And you can see that these are the clear responsibility. The row hat is only significant in the clear absolute distance and neighbors only. And as we saw from the graphs, even though that was statistically significant, it was substantively quite small. All right. Now, if we look at the measures in the less clear cases, no matter what we did, we got a significant effect, right? But we sort of, on this part of it, we just sort of said, well, we're agnostic. They're formal modelers who will fight you all day for their favorite version of this. And we said, no, let's just make each one of them and see which one comes out the best in terms of model fit. And this is the one that we use, and that's why we did
clear
that.
in the less clear situation of the space effect here of Moran Gary's index.
Yeah.
Highly significant.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the quadratic distance here fails some of the tests, but I mean, all the others are coming out, very loud and clear that there are these spatial effects, and that all the other models of party competition have ignored. Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned in the beginning that you're especially interested in countries with parliamentary and multi-party systems because there's more parties in the spectrum. The complication of that is in those countries you also have coalition voting.
Yeah.
So, for example, I'm not so familiar with the Irish case, but the Dutch case, I'm a bit more familiar. I would expect that it might be less interesting for, say, the Labour Party, which you had in 82, to move to the left if they know that people might be interested to punish the Christian Democrats for having messed up the country, and the Labour Party, if it wants to be in government next period, would like to move closer, not further away, because it wants to go closer to the Liberals in order to, because I guess when they move to the left, they might win in the points in the elections, but they won't be in government. So how much does it matter for a party strategy to say, oh, we want more seats, but you don't stand a chance to get us to build a government, because then the coalition, I think in 82, was sailing out with VVD.
I think that's right. Yeah.
So, can we fit coalition in this model?
Well, you're absolutely right. And in these cases where the elections never or almost never return a single party majority, there's really 2 stages of competition. And so there's the fighting for the votes, and then there's the fighting for who's going to be in government. Now, we're only modeling the fight for the votes. And so we're ignoring that part. And so you're absolutely right. And that is very important. However, there's been a lot of research recently trying to model that second stage. Trying to model, based on how can we predict which government's going to form, which coalition is going to form. And what they found is that first stage matters a lot for that second stage. So the gaining or losing votes has a big effect on whether or not parties will partner with you. But in the specific case of Dutch politics, which this is always the danger of presenting research that pools across so many different countries is you can't be an expert in all of them. I'll be careful, but I'm sure I've got some ignorance there. I think there was a period there where the Labour Party was seen as an impossible partner, right? Because they were so far to the left that certain parties on the right said, no, we could never form a coalition with them. And so you're absolutely right. And that also gets back to George's question about there's got to be a limit to how far you can move, either to the left or the right. So yeah, you know, that's the beauty of this. We've ignored that, so that means we can do another paper where we pay attention to it. Okay. Tim Stimson, who's done a lot of work on the use of methodology in political science, has this unofficial Stimson's law that we always talk about. And his law is that you can only solve one difficult problem at a time. And that's good. That keeps us in business, right?